When I think back to that camping trip in high school, the memory still feels sharper than most of the other things I did around that time. A lot of the days from those years blur together, but that night in the woods has stayed clear. We had planned the trip for weeks. It was supposed to be one of those rites of passage before everyone grew up too much, when you're still young enough to do dumb things, but old enough to make it out on your own. We packed our bags with cheap gear, way too much junk food, some trail snacks, and whatever else we thought we needed. None of us had ever really camped out so deep before, and that was the point. We wanted to go further than the usual park grounds and push into the mountains where people didn't usually go. The hike itself felt endless. We left in the afternoon, and the trail went from dirt paths to rocky climbs, winding switchbacks and narrow tracks between tall trees. Our backpacks grew heavier every hour, straps digging into our shoulders, sweat soaking our shirts. The sun fell behind the ridges faster than we expected, and the woods darkened quickly. I remember how the trees started looking like walls, shutting us in with their black trunks and overlapping branches. By the time we reached a spot that felt flat enough to set up camp, none of us had much energy left. We didn't even really discuss whether it was the right spot or not. Just dropped our packs and started setting up tents. The ground was rough, covered in pine needles, sticks, and rocks. I had to clear a small patch to lay my tent out, and even then it wasn't flat. I hammered the stakes into the dirt with a rock I picked up from the ground, hands sore from the weight of the pack. The air felt colder than it had been during the hike, sharp and damp like the smell of stone and soil. The sky was already deep blue with only a faint glow left on the horizon. By the time the tents were standing, everyone was too tired to do much else. We ate something quick, a couple of granola bars and chips, nothing hot because no one wanted to mess with firewood. Then we crashed into our tents. Each of us burrowed in his sleeping bags, trying to get comfortable on the uneven ground. At first, sleep came easily. My body was so worn out that my muscles felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth. I remember hearing the muffled sounds of the forest around me, the occasional rustle of leaves, some insect chirping, and faint creaks of trees shifting in the wind. That was normal, and I expected it. But after a while, I woke up for no clear reason. It was still dark, the kind of thick dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face unless you turn on a light. My watch said it was around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was just the discomfort of sleeping on hard ground that pulled me awake. Then I noticed it, this faint sound outside. It was soft, almost like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another sound, this time on the other side of the tent. My chest tightened instantly. I held still, listening hard, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. But the noises kept happening slow and careful, like something moving step by step in the dark. And it wasn't just from one direction. There were multiple spots where it came from different angles around the tent. The thought of animals crossed my mind first, but it didn't feel like that. Animals usually crash through underbrush, make quick movements, maybe sniff or snort. This felt deliberate. The steps were spaced apart, slow, almost as if whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I could hear the leaves crunching faintly and the dry twigs snapping under weight. My breathing picked up without me wanting it to. Inside the tent, it was so thin and flimsy, just fabric between me and the outside. I became hyper-aware of how exposed I was. I lay there frozen, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chest, heart pounding so hard I thought it was loud enough for whatever was out there to hear. The sound circled closer, then paused, then picked up again. The silence between them felt worse than the noises themselves, like something was just waiting. I thought about waking the others, but I didn't want to move or make a sound. It felt like even the tiniest noise might draw attention to me. Minutes stretched out, and the fear built until I couldn't take it anymore. My flashlight was beside me, and I reached for it slowly, my hand shaking. My fingers closed around it, cold metal against my palm. I told myself I needed to look, that not knowing was worse. I unzipped the tent just a little, just enough to stick my hand out and flick on the light. The beam cut through the black, bouncing off the trees and the ground. For a moment, all I saw were trunks and branches, shadows stretching out in every direction. Then I saw them, eyes, shining eyes reflecting the beam back at me. Not small eyes near the ground, but large and high up, almost at the level of a man's face. And there weren't just one pair, there were several. For 6, maybe more, spread around in the dark, all fixed toward me. My blood turned to ice. They didn't blink, just stared back, glowing faintly in the light. The way they stood, tall and still, made them look unnatural in that moment. My first thought was people, someone watching us, but the eyes didn't move like a person's would. They stayed level, calm, unbothered by the light. I couldn't breathe right. My mouth was dry, and I felt heat spreading up my neck even though the night was cold. I kept the beam steady, hand trembling, until I finally made out the shape of one of them. Antlers caught the edge of the light, tall and branching like bone. The outline of a body appeared, solid, heavy. That's when it hit me. They were deer. A herd of them, standing quietly all around our camp. Relief came fast, but didn't take away all the fear. Seeing them explained it. But in that moment before I recognized what they were, I had truly believed something was stalking us. The deer didn't move much, just shifted slightly on their legs, eyes catching the light like glass marbles. They weren't afraid of me, not really. They just stood there in the dark, calm, silent, watching. After a while, I lowered the light and pulled the zipper closed again. My hand still shook. I lay back in the tent, listening, and the sounds outside made more sense now. Hooves on dry leaves, bodies brushing against low branches. Still, it was hard to fall asleep again. Even knowing it was deer didn't erase the image of those glowing eyes all around me. I kept seeing them when I closed my own. Morning finally came with pale sunlight breaking through the trees. When I stepped out of the tent, the ground showed signs of where they had been. Hoof tracks pressed into the dirt, some droppings scattered near the edge of the camp. The others hadn't noticed anything, still groggy from their sleep, packing up their gear like nothing had happened. To them, it was just another morning after camping. To me, it felt like I had been awake all night fighting with the unknown. Looking back, it's almost funny that it was just deer. But in that pitch-black forest, in the middle of the night, with no walls or doors to protect me, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something bigger than me was out there, surrounding us, waiting in silence. That trip stuck with me more than any of the others. It was the first time I realized how wild the world really is when you step into it without barriers, and how fast your imagination can turn ordinary things into the worst possibilities. Even now, when I remember those glowing eyes, I still feel a shiver down my spine before the relief follows. I had been on the trail longer than I planned that evening, just moving along without paying attention to the fading light. By the time I noticed how dark the valley was getting, the shadows had already closed in on the trees, and the chill that comes down fast in the evening was creeping across the ground. My plan had been to reach a spot further out, pitch my tent, and settle in, but I knew I'd screwed up by letting time slip away. I didn't want to set up camp in complete darkness, especially with no cell service. That's when I ran into a local guy coming down the path. He looked harmless enough, older, carrying nothing but a small pack. He seemed friendly, knew the area, and pointed me toward a small camping spot near the road and river. He told me it was close, but tucked away, not obvious unless you knew where to look. I figured that was a good option considering how late it was. The spot turned out to be perfect, hidden just enough to not be visible from the road, but still close to it, flat ground, the sound of the river not too far off. I set up a fire, cracked open a beer, and put on one of my friend comedy podcasts through my little Bluetooth speaker. The flames lit up the area, and I knew anyone nearby could see and hear me, but it didn't bother me at that point. It felt good to unwind after the long hike, sitting in my chair, listening to jokes and sipping my drink. I was loud, careless, visible, but I figured I was fine. When the fire started to burn down, I debated setting up my tent, but decided against it. I had all my gear in the back of my truck under the topper, and I was already tired. It felt easier to just crawl in there, use my sleeping bag, and crash without messing around with stakes and poles in the dark. I woke up early. The sky just started to turn pale. The night had been quiet. No sounds except the river in the background and the occasional crack of a branch out in the trees. Nothing unusual for a place like that. I got out of the truck, stretched, got a fire going again, and opened another beer while setting up breakfast. There was something really peaceful about that morning. The way the smoke from the fire drifted up into the air the sound of the river mixing with the soft wind. It felt like I had the whole valley to myself. That's when I noticed movement at the edge of my camp. A man. I hadn't heard him come up. He was just suddenly there, standing still near the tree line. My first thought was maybe another camper, or maybe even the local guy I met last night checking in. But as I looked closer, that thought slipped away. He didn't look like a hiker. He didn't look like someone out here for recreation. His beard was long and unkempt, gray tangled into it, his hair dirty and sticking out in every direction. What really caught me, though, were the plastic grocery bags. Dozens of them tied all over his clothes, hanging from his arms, his belt, his shoulders flapping slightly in the breeze. Some were faded white, others yellow or blue, all crumpled and weather-beaten. He looked like he was wearing armor made of garbage. I waited for him to say something, but he didn't. He didn't even look directly at me. His eyes seemed to slide past me, as if I wasn't there, while he slowly shifted his weight and stepped along the perimeter of my campsite. He wasn't coming closer in a direct way, just circling, moving, pausing, moving again. His face didn't change, no recognition, no greeting, nothing. I tried to break the silence by saying something about the nice weather. Nothing. I made a casual gesture toward the fire and food, like offering him some breakfast. Nothing. He just kept that slow pacing, his back turning toward me half the time, then coming around again, always avoiding direct contact. The plastic bags rustled softly as he moved. The longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't some passing hiker or someone out for a morning walk. His clothes were filthy, layers stacked on layers, and those bags made him look almost unreal, but he was very real. I couldn't figure out what he wanted. He hadn't said a word, hadn't asked for food, hadn't acknowledged me at all. He was just there, close enough to be a problem, but not close enough to confront. I set down my plate of food and reached for the bear spray I'd kept right by my chair. My buck knife was in the open too, and I kept glancing at it. I didn't want to escalate anything, but my nerves were tightening up fast. I tried again, louder this time, asking if he wanted something to eat. Still no answer. I grabbed one of my beers and held it up like I was offering it. He paused, his head tilting slightly, but still no response. Then he turned slowly, gave me his back, and began to drift along the far side of the camp, hands twitching at the bags tied to his sleeves. He wasn't leaving, he wasn't engaging, just staying. By that point, I realized nothing good was going to come out of this. I couldn't let it drag on. The silence, the way he wouldn't leave, the way he wouldn't acknowledge me. It felt like he was playing some kind of game that only he understood. My chest was tight, heart thudding hard. I stood up, bear spray in my hand, the canister already uncapped. My voice came out sharper than I expected, loud and cutting, telling him he either needed to move on or deal with me. He didn't react, didn't even twitch. I took a step forward, then another, raising the spray. That finally broke whatever strange pattern he was stuck in. He slumped slightly, shoulders sagging, and without a word he turned and walked off toward the trees. His movements were heavy, uneven, like he was dragging himself. I stayed where I was, watching until he disappeared behind the tree line. Even then I waited, listening for any sign that he was still close. Nothing but the river and the crack of the fire. My hands were shaking as I started moving fast, shoving my gear back into the truck. I doused the fire, tossed everything into the back without caring about how it was packed, and climbed into the cab. My eyes scanned the tree line the whole time, expecting him to reappear, but he didn't. When the engine started, the sound felt like the best thing I'd heard all morning. I pulled out, tires spitting gravel, and didn't slow down until I was back on the main road with Miles between me and that hidden little campsite. As I drove, I kept thinking about the night before, how loud I'd been with the fire and the podcast, how visible I must have been from the road or even further off, how easy it would have been for anyone to just stand in the dark and watch me while I laughed and drank, totally oblivious. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe he had seen me then, maybe even been there the whole time, waiting for the morning to come. I thanked myself for being lazy, for deciding not to pitch the tent. If I had been in that thin layer of fabric instead of the solid shell of the truck, I don't think I would have slept at all, not with someone like that moving around outside. By the time I reached the next town, The tension had finally started to ease, but the image of him, those bags rustling around him, his eyes never once looking at me, stayed stuck in my head. It wasn't the kind of encounter you just brush off. It wasn't a story about getting spooked by shadows or animals in the night. It was real, a stranger in the woods, unpredictable, unreadable, and far too close. I don't camp in places like that the same way anymore. Now I stay aware of where I set up, how visible I am, and I always keep my truck ready to go at a moment's notice. That morning in the valley taught me that sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the wilderness at all. It's who else might be sharing it with you. I set up camp late in the afternoon, out in a patch of bushland I had picked because it was quiet and tucked away. It wasn't far from Fire Trail, but far enough that I wouldn't expect anyone to just wander past. The ground was littered with dry sticks, gum leaves, and bark, the kind that makes noise with the smallest step, so it felt like a safe place to be alone. Anything big moving around would be heard long before it came close. I pitched my small tent on a patch of mostly flat ground near a couple of trees that would block some of the wind. There wasn't much else around, just bush stretching out in every direction. I spent the evening just doing the usual camping stuff, cooking up some food, sitting around with my headlamp on, and reading a bit. As the sun went down, the bush grew still. No sounds of cars, no people, just the occasional bird settling in for the night and the faint rustling of small animals in the leaf litter. After a while, even that stopped. I turned in earlier than I usually do, crawled into my sleeping bag, and listened to the quiet. Out there, you become very aware of every small sound, so I kept my ears open at first, but the silence made it easy to drift off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I lay still, listening. There were no footsteps, no crunching, no rustling. It was dead quiet. Then I heard it, a faint plopping sound. It wasn't steady, not like dripping water. Just one sound, then nothing for a long time, then another. It wasn't close to the tent, but it wasn't far either. Out there, noises carry strangely, so it was hard to judge the distance. I stayed frozen, listening hard. No other noise came with it. No footsteps, no animals moving through the brush. Just that single plop now and then. I thought maybe it was water dripping off a tree onto a rock or a log. But the bush had been dry all week. No rain, no damp. It didn't make sense, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing and pulled the sleeping bag tighter, eyes on the thin tent fabric above me. Eventually the silence returned completely, and I must have fallen back asleep. When I woke again, it was early morning. Light was filtering weakly through the tent, that kind of soft gray before the sun really breaks through. I stretched, reached for my boots, and unzipped the tent door. As I pushed my head out, I froze. Right there on the ground, barely a foot from where my head had been while I slept, was the severed head of a kangaroo. It was fresh, too fresh. The fur was matted around the neck where it had been cut or torn, and the eyes were open. There was no smell of rot, no flies buzzing around yet, which told me it hadn't been sitting there long. My stomach turned instantly, and I felt that sharp rush of cold that goes through your whole body when you know something is very wrong. I scanned the ground around the tent. There were no tracks that I could see at first, but with all the sticks and leaves, it would be hard to miss every sound if something big had come close in the night. I had heard nothing but that strange plopping sound. I tried to think if maybe it had been dropped by some animal, but it didn't fit. A dingo wouldn't decapitate a kangaroo clean like that, and then carefully place the head next to my tent. And even if it had somehow dragged it there, I would have heard the movement, the snapping of branches, the crunching underfoot. This wasn't the middle of the city. Out here, every step sounded like a gunshot on the dry ground. The longer I stared at that head, the more I realized someone had put it there. Not an animal, not some accident. A person had been standing outside my tent while I slept, quiet enough that I hadn't heard them, and left it there. That thought made my chest feel tight, like I couldn't draw a proper breath. I forced myself to pack up fast. My hand shook as I shoved my sleeping bag into its stuffed sack. Every sound I made, every zip, every clank of gear seemed too loud, like it would draw whoever did this back. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees and the underbrush, expecting to see someone standing there. The kangaroo's head stayed in the corner of my vision the whole time, and I avoided looking straight at it again. I didn't stop to eat, didn't bother with coffee, didn't even check if I left anything behind. I just broke down the tent, shoved everything into my pack in the messiest way, and started walking back toward the trail. My boots crunched loudly over the sticks, and I hated the noise, but there was no way around it. The air felt heavier than it had the night before. I couldn't shake the thought that someone could be out there, watching me move away, waiting for me to find what they had left. I kept replaying the sound I had heard. That plopping. It clicked in my head as I walked. It hadn't been water. It could have been something wet hitting the ground. Maybe the head itself being dropped into place. That thought nearly made me run, but I forced myself to keep a steady pace so I didn't trip or fall. It took me longer than usual to get back to the fire trail, but once I stepped onto it, the relief of being out of the thick bush was real. Still, I didn't feel safe until I reached my car. Even then, I kept looking around as I unlocked it, convinced someone was about to step out from behind a tree. I drove out faster than I should have, tires skidding a little on the dirt. I didn't stop until I hit the bitumen road and kept going, putting as much distance as possible between me and that spot. Only then, after miles of road behind me, did I let myself breathe properly. I never figured out who did it or why. Maybe some sick prank, maybe something darker. What I do know is someone had been close enough to me while I slept to leave that kangaroo's head without making a sound, and I will never forget that. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't an accident. Someone was there, and they wanted me to know it. I haven't camped alone since.